My son's wedding invitation arrived, with my name nowhere to be found. The sting was sharp, but I steadied my breath, letting silence speak for me. That same afternoon, I called the venue and quietly withdrew the $100,000 I'd been covering. They thought leaving me off the list would end the story, but it was only the opening act. Before I continue the story, please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from. The morning air in Charleston still carried the crispness of early spring, the kind that made you wrap your robe just a little tighter even as sunlight poured over the pastel houses across the street. The oaks lining the block were just beginning to green, their new leaves filtering the light into soft, dappled patches on the brick sidewalks. From somewhere downtown, church bells chimed a slow, deliberate melody, too far away to be urgent, but close enough to feel familiar. I'd lived in this neighborhood most of my life, and mornings like this had always been a comfort. I stepped onto the front porch, mug of coffee in one hand, reaching into the mailbox with the other. Most days, it was bills, grocery flyers, or the occasional letter from an old friend. But today, my fingers brushed something thick, cool to the touch. I pulled it out and saw a large ivory envelope, its surface buttery smooth beneath my fingertips. The gold-embossed crest at the top left was unmistakable. Our family's own, designed generations ago. It should have been a warm moment. Instead, my eyes caught on the first detail that made my stomach tighten. The address read, Mr. Mrs. Harkins. My late husband's name, still printed as though he were alive. My name, absent. It wasn't a slip of the pen. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, the kind of oversight that isn't an oversight at all. I thought back to the etiquette lessons I used to teach my high school seniors, how addressing a person properly was the first act of respect. Whoever wrote this invitation had made a choice. A sharp little sting ran under my ribs, though my face stayed calm. Quietly, almost under my breath, I repeated an old Southern saying my mother had favored. If they don't call you by name, honey, they're already trying to erase you. I stepped back inside, set the envelope on the kitchen table, and stared at it. The steam from my coffee had thinned, leaving the surface lukewarm. I didn't open the letter right away. Instead, I stood there, feeling the quiet settle in around me like a heavy shawl, bracing myself for whatever words might be waiting inside. I took a slow sip, then reached for the ivory envelope again. The paper sliced cleanly under the letter opener, the sound crisp in the stillness of my kitchen. I slid the contents free, a folded card with gold filigree thick enough to feel expensive. My eyes traced the swirling script, reading the formal announcement of my grandson's upcoming wedding. The date, the venue, the time, it was all there, as perfect as a magazine spread. But my gaze caught on the next detail. The names on the guest list tucked inside. They'd printed seating arrangements for the ceremony and reception, small enough to require my reading glasses. I scanned each table number. No grandmother, no Mrs. Vianette Harkins, no seat assigned to me at all. I set the paper down slowly, my fingertips lingering on its edge. For years, I'd been part of every milestone, birthdays, graduations, weddings. I'd stood for photographs, baked cakes, and given speeches. Now I was nowhere on their paper map. There was a hollow ache in my chest, one I knew too well. Widows have a way of disappearing in their own families. It happens so quietly you hardly notice until you're standing outside the circle. I drew in a slow breath, remembering a line from Eleanor Roosevelt I'd kept pinned on my fridge. No one can make you feel inferior without your consent. I whispered it to myself, not as comfort, but as a promise. This wouldn't slide past me without question. I walked to the phone on the counter, the old corded kind I'd never had the heart to replace. My fingers hesitated over the buttons before dialing my son's number. It rang twice before he picked up. "Hi, Mom," he said, his voice quick, distracted. "Everything okay?" "Good morning, darling," I replied, letting my tone stay warm. "I just got the mail. Beautiful invitation." "Oh, great, glad it arrived," he said, and I could hear the faint clink of dishes in the background. "I did notice something," I continued, steady. "The envelope had your father's name. No mention of me. And inside I couldn't find my seat on the list." There was a pause, the kind that tells you someone's eyes just darted toward the nearest exit. "Yeah, about that. Things have been hectic. We're still sorting seating arrangements." I smiled into the phone, though my lips felt tight. "So, was my name just forgotten? Or is there something I should know?" He gave a short laugh, the kind that tries to smooth over a crack. "We'll talk about it later, Mom. I've got to run, so much to do." The line went dead before I could answer. I stared at the handset in my palm, hearing the faint hum of the disconnected line. That wasn't busyness. That was avoidance, plain as day. In the South, people say more with what they don't say than with what they do. And his silence had said plenty. I set the phone down and began to walk through the house, my slippers making soft sounds against the hardwood. Every wall seemed to hold a piece of our family history, framed photos from weddings past, Christmas gatherings, Sunday suppers. In each one, I was there, in the center, smiling, holding someone's arm. Now I felt like someone had cropped me out of the picture without telling me. I stopped in front of a photo from my own wedding. My late husband's smile was wide, his hand over mine. His voice echoed in my memory. "When people show you who they are, believe them the first time." This wasn't an accident. It was a message. I wouldn't respond in anger. That's never been my way. Instead, I'd do what I've always done when someone underestimates me: listen, watch, and gather facts. The truth has a way of showing itself if you let people think you're not looking. Names began to form in my mind. Orlena, who'd been in this family long enough to know every bit of gossip. A couple of family friends who never could resist a chance to share what they'd overheard. And the wedding planner, someone I could bump into at the right moment. I went back to the kitchen and poured myself a second cup of coffee, steady now, no tremor in my hand. The sun had risen higher, throwing sharp beams through the lace curtains. If they thought 74 made me too fragile to push back, they had forgotten who I was. Age doesn't dull the mind. It sharpens the edges you've been filing down your whole life. I took a sip, letting the warmth spread through me, and felt something shift. I wasn't angry yet, but I was curious, and curiosity, in my hands, has never ended well for those who underestimated me. The drive to Orlena's house took me along streets I could navigate blindfolded, though I'd never tempt fate that way. Charleston in mid-morning had a rhythm of its own, delivery trucks rumbling past pastel facades, shopkeepers sweeping their thresholds, the air still carrying a hint of the ocean. The live oaks along Murray Boulevard cast dappled shadows across my hood, and for a moment I let my eyes trace their branches like old friends. Her porch was exactly as I'd left it last spring. 2 white rocking chairs angled toward the street, potted geraniums blooming in defiance of the cool air, and that hand-painted welcome sign she refused to replace no matter how the paint peeled. I caught the scent before I knocked, cinnamon rolls fresh from the oven drifting through the open kitchen window. Orlena and I went back over 40 years, through PTA meetings, choir rehearsals, and late-night phone calls that lasted longer than either of our marriages. If there was gossip worth knowing, she'd have it before the ink dried. That was why I'd chosen her porch today. She opened the door with a smile that stopped short of her eyes. "V," she said, pulling me into a hug that was warm but careful. "I thought you might stop by." "I was in the neighborhood," I lied, stepping inside. Her kitchen smelled like comfort, coffee brewing, cinnamon sugar melting into dough. We sat at the round oak table in our usual spots, hers facing the stove, mine near the window. Kitchens, I'd learned long ago, were where the truth spilled easiest. We started safe. She told me about the church bazaar coming up, a new bakery on King Street that made eclairs worth sinning for, and her granddaughter's upcoming graduation. I nodded in the right places, sipped my coffee, and let her words fill the room while I waited for the right moment. "So," I said casually, breaking a piece off my cinnamon roll, "I hear the wedding's shaping up nicely." She paused, a fraction of a second, but I caught it. "It's coming together," she said, stirring her coffee, though she hadn't added sugar. "You know how these things are. Seating charts alone could start a war." I smiled, keeping my voice light. "I've survived my share." "Who's sitting where this time?" Her gaze flicked to the window, then back to me. "Well, some folks might be surprised." "In a good way?" I asked, tilting my head, letting the question hang. She hesitated, then sighed. You know how people talk." I leaned in slightly, masking the tightening in my chest with a sip of coffee. "People talk every day. What are they saying today?" She lowered her voice, though it was just the two of us. "I was at the hair salon last week. Your daughter-in-law's mother was there, talking about how certain guests might not fit the tone they're going for." I set my cup down carefully. "The tone?" She didn't say names, but Orlena's eyes softened. "It sounded like they meant you. Something about avoiding complications with old family tensions." I kept my face still, but inside, the words lodged like a splinter. Complications, tone, as if I were an old chair that didn't match the decor. "Maybe it's just chatter," she added quickly. "You know how folks can be. Nothing better to do than stir the pot." "Yes," I said slowly, "and sometimes they stir it on purpose." She reached across the table, her fingers brushing mine. "I hate telling you this, V, but I figured you'd rather hear it from me than be blindsided." I nodded once. "I appreciate it, really." We let the silence stretch. I thought back to moments I'd stood on that family's porch, bringing casseroles when her people were sick, watching fireworks together on the 4th. I'd ignored the sideways comments, the polite but not invitations that came late. Now they'd stopped pretending. I asked her a few more questions, gentle and roundabout, enough to confirm the story without making her feel like a traitor. She gave me the shape of things, and I filled in the rest myself. When my coffee was nearly gone, I stood, thanking her for the rolls, the company, and the candor. "You've given me something to think about," I said, and meant it. On the drive home, Charleston's beauty felt sharper, as if the freshly painted facades were daring me to look for cracks. I knew now this wasn't a mistake, it was a decision, and decisions can be unmade. They thought they'd left me off the list. They hadn't realized I was writing my own. The next morning, Charleston was wearing its late spring perfume, jasmine threading through the air, mixing with the salt coming off the harbor. I took my time getting ready, not because I had anywhere pressing to be, but because the day ahead required the right frame of mind. If Orlena's kitchen had given me the first hints, Magnolia Vine was where I expected the petals to hide the thorns. The bell over the shop door chimed the way it always had, a soft metallic ring that instantly pulled me back years. Hydrangeas and roses crowded the window display, their colors so rich they almost looked painted. Magnolia leaves framed the counter like a southern crown, their dark green polished and dignified. The air was cool, heavy with the scent of damp earth and cut stems, the kind of smell that clings to your memory. Leona was behind the counter, her hair pinned up with the same tortoiseshell clip I'd seen her wear since my daughter's graduation party. She was tying an extravagant bow around a bouquet so large it looked fit for a governor's mansion. We'd known each other through more than just flowers, church events, school fundraisers, funerals. I'd seen her hands arrange blooms for almost every milestone in our community. "Well, if it isn't Miss V," she greeted, smile warm, eyes sharp. "You're out early." "I thought I'd get ahead of the heat," I said lightly. "And I need something nice for my neighbor's anniversary." That part was true enough. The Hydes had been married 50 years, and a bouquet wouldn't go to waste. But the real reason I was here was folded neatly under my voice, the way you tuck a note inside a birthday card. Leona motioned me toward a display of pale peonies. These just came in, soft as butter and twice as sweet. I touched one of the blossoms, pretending to weigh its merits. They're beautiful, I murmured. Wedding season always brings out the best flowers, doesn't it? Her laugh was a short, airy thing. That it does. Busy, too. Barely time to breathe. I let her lead with the small talk, commenting on the sudden rise in prices, the shortage of tulips after the last storm, the debate over whether sunflowers were too rustic for formal events. Then, as naturally as refilling a glass of tea, I tilted us toward my true interest. You must be working on something big with all these special orders. Leona's hands didn't stop moving, but her eyes flicked up just for a second. Oh, you know, the Wentworth estate's got a wedding coming up. Keeps a girl on her toes. I nodded, keeping my face arranged like someone hearing about the weather. Inside, I braced. That's a lovely venue. I imagine the guest list is something to see. Well, that's not for me to say, she replied, looping ribbon with practiced precision. But then, almost offhand, they did have some last-minute changes. Happens sometimes. My attention sharpened. Changes? Just some rearranging. Certain folks got moved to the auxiliary reception area. She gave a little shrug. They say it's for space, but between you and me, that's a rare thing for a Wentworth event. Usually everyone gets their place in the main hall. My gaze drifted, casual as possible, toward her work table. A seating chart printout was half covered by a spool of cream ribbon, and there, in the discard pile beside it, a scrap of paper with Harkins faintly written in the margin. Space can be tricky, I said slowly. But I guess that kind of shift usually takes a nudge from someone important. Leona's pause was brief but telling. Only when someone high up insists. Her tone suggested she'd already said more than she meant. In my mind, Orlena's words about the bride's mother began to braid themselves with this new thread. A pattern was forming, and it looked more deliberate than accidental. The knot in my chest tightened, but I kept my smile in place. Leona moved to the side, reaching for another bundle of stems. Margot's been particular about the color scheme, wants everything just so. That's her right, I suppose. Margot. The name slipped out like a petal catching on the breeze. Not a stranger, someone who'd been at enough church functions and luncheons to make her presence seem harmless. But influence can be soft-spoken, and I knew Margot had the kind of sway that could change a seating chart without ever signing her name. I didn't confront Leona. Instead, I thanked her for the peonies, paid in cash, and complimented her bow work. There's no sense slamming a door you might need to slip through again. Walking out, the sun hit me square in the eyes, and for a moment the brightness felt like a dare. Around me, couples leaned close over arrangements, laughing about centerpieces and boutonniere. I carried my bouquet the way you'd carry a secret, cradled, careful, and entirely my own. The drive home wound through the historic district, where pastel facades stood like polite liars, fresh paint hiding old wood that sagged beneath. My grandmother used to say, "You can catch more flies with honey than vinegar, but sometimes you need a good swat." I knew which method I'd need for Margot. By the time I turned into my street, the peonies were filling the car with their sweetness, but my thoughts were sharper than thorns. Margot might have been tending this particular garden of exclusion, but I'd just found my way into the soil. If she was the gardener of this plan, it was time to see exactly what she'd been planting. The Harbor Club always had an air about it, like the scent of magnolia blossoms after a summer storm, something old, refined, and meant to last. I stepped through its arched glass doors into the reception hall, where sunlight streamed through towering windows and spilled across white linen tables set with gleaming silverware. Crystal chandeliers cast a soft glow, their facets catching every movement in the room like a watchful eye. The crowd was a mix of old Charleston families whose surnames carried weight, society wives dressed in floral silks, and younger professionals in tailored suits, eager to prove they belonged. Margot was impossible to miss, stationed at the center table in a cream suit that matched the pearl strands resting just above her collarbone. Her posture alone commanded the circle around her, a blend of gracious hostess and reigning queen. I reminded myself firmly that I wasn't here to storm her throne. Not yet. Today was for listening, watching, gathering threads before I wove them into a net. I smiled easily as I crossed the room, exchanging pleasantries with familiar faces. A handshake here, a warm nod there, just enough to blend seamlessly into the ebb and flow. My mind filed away who avoided my gaze and who met it too quickly, small tells in a larger game. I chose my seat with care, close enough to overhear Margot's conversations, but far enough to avoid being drawn into them prematurely. Mrs. Cunningham, whose hydrangeas had once been the talk of every garden tour, settled into the chair beside me. She greeted me with a fond squeeze of my hand. "Lovely turnout today," she said, adjusting her wide-brimmed hat. "It is," I agreed, letting my tone stay light. Charleston never disappoints when there's an excuse to dress for lunch. We spoke of the weather, the annual charity gala, and her plans for replanting the azaleas after the last frost. I nodded at all the right moments, but my attention was tuned elsewhere. Margot's voice carried just enough for me to catch fragments, and her glances, fleeting but deliberate, landed in my direction like tossed coins, waiting to see if I'd pick them up. I tilted my iced tea glass in her line of sight once, a silent acknowledgement without invitation. My posture remained open, hands resting loosely in my lap, as though I were the picture of calm authority. Halfway through the entree, Margot struck. She was recounting some story about a society wedding from years ago, her laugh a practiced melody. Then, slipping it in with the same ease as buttering a roll, she said, "Of course, certain traditions are better left in the past, like reserving prime seats for those who can't appreciate them." A ripple of polite laughter traveled the table. Some glanced my way, subtle, almost reflexive, before looking back at Margot. The sting wasn't in the words themselves, but in the calculated precision of their delivery. She wanted me to rise to the bait. I didn't. Instead, I sipped my tea, letting the cold bite of the ice anchor me. My grandmother's voice brushed the edge of my thoughts. "Don't swat the fly until it lands twice." Margot's eyes flicked toward me once more, perhaps hoping for the satisfaction of a flinch. I gave her none. I noted, however, who laughed the loudest. 3 women, all close enough to Margot to have been in on the rehearsal. Mrs. Cunningham leaned in, lowering her voice. "That was pointed." I smiled, still watching Margot's table. "Some folks plant weeds and call them wildflowers." Dessert had just been served, a delicate lemon tart, its meringue peaks toasted to perfection, when Henry Alcott appeared at my elbow. I'd known him for years in the peripheral way you know anyone who's chaired more committees than you can count. His reputation in Charleston politics was ironclad. "Mind if I join you for a moment?" he asked quietly, sliding into the empty chair before I could answer. "I suspect you were going to anyway," I replied with a small smile. He didn't bother with pleasantries. "Margot's been overly involved in the wedding plans." His gaze was steady, weighing my reaction. "And I think you should know, there are things happening behind the scenes you won't hear unless they come from someone like me." I arched a brow. "Such as?" He glanced around, lowering his voice further. "This isn't the place. But if you can spare some time this evening, I'll tell you what I've heard. It may change how you choose to play this." Something in his tone, earnest, unvarnished, told me he wasn't angling for favor. He was offering an opening. And in a game like this, an opening was worth its weight in gold. "Where?" I asked. "The old cigar lounge, corner table, 7 o'clock. I extended my hand under the table and he shook it once. Firm, deliberate, an unspoken pact. The luncheon began to wind down with a round of applause for a charity initiative Margot's circle had sponsored. She stood with the rest, her smile gracious but cool, her conversation reserved for those who posed no threat. She didn't approach me, I didn't approach her. That was fine. I took my time leaving, stopping to thank the staff for their service and exchanging farewells with guests whose opinions would matter later. Each gesture was deliberate, no trace of visible frustration, no hint of the steel tightening beneath the surface. As I stepped out into the crisp afternoon light, the streets of Charleston hummed with the slow rhythm of carriages and shop bells. My reflection in the club's glass door caught me, smiling, calm, almost serene. Let them think I was smiling because I'd lost. They had no idea I was smiling because I'd already started winning. By sunset, Henry's truth would either sharpen my blade or dull it beyond repair. Charleston's evening air held a damp coolness that wrapped around me as I stepped off the curb and into the short brick path leading to the cigar lounge. Gas lanterns flickered outside, their glow catching on the brass handle of the heavy wooden door. Inside, the space was hushed, almost reverent. Deep leather chairs sat like thrones around low mahogany tables, and the smell of cedar and aged tobacco hung in the air. A few men in tailored suits murmured over glasses of amber liquid, their voices blending with the faint strains of a jazz piano from somewhere unseen. Henry was already in a corner booth, posture relaxed but not casual, like someone who could shift into a fight at the first wrong move. A tumbler of bourbon rested near his hand, its surface catching the dim light. When his gaze found mine, there was an unspoken acknowledgement. We were here for truth, not pleasantries. We shook hands lightly. "You handled yourself well this afternoon," he said, his voice pitched low. "Most would have snapped back." I slid into the seat across from him, setting my bag beside me. "Sometimes silence is louder than words," I replied. My order was quick, unsweetened iced tea, and it was deliberate. This wasn't a social call. I wanted my mind clear. The server departed and Henry leaned back slightly, eyes assessing. Margot's little jab wasn't just an offhand remark. She was testing you, seeing how you'd react in front of people whose opinions carry weight. I let a faint smile tug at my lips. If that was her test, I'm curious what she thought she learned. "She learned you don't flinch in public," he said, "and that will bother her more than if you'd thrown the first punch." He took a slow sip of bourbon before continuing. "She's not as invincible as she likes to think. Even in her own circles, she's made enemies. Today, I saw two people at that luncheon shift uncomfortably when she spoke, people who might not be in her corner anymore." I tilted my head. "Names?" He gave them without hesitation. Both were well placed in local society, their families intertwined with Margot's for decades. I stored them away, knowing that in Charleston, alliances can unravel with the right tug. The tea arrived, cool condensation dripping down the glass. I wrapped my hands around it, letting the chill ground me. "You said you had something I needed to hear," I prompted. Henry's eyes flicked briefly to the door, as if to check who might be within earshot. Then he leaned forward, elbows on the table. "A week ago, I was here. Margot was in the far booth with her attorney, didn't notice me in the next room. They were discussing the wedding, but it wasn't flowers and guest lists. She was pushing for changes that could affect who gets access to certain estate properties during the reception." I felt the faintest ripple in my chest, but my face stayed composed. "She also brought up guest seating, specifically moving you farther from the front, citing family optics," he said. "Her attorney warned her that certain changes might skirt into legal trouble, but she dismissed it." I stirred my tea slowly, the clink of ice filling the silence between us. "There's more," Henry continued. "The attorney mentioned a draft document. He didn't say what it was, but from the way she talked, I'd bet on a will or trust adjustment, something she wants to cement socially before it ever hits legal ink." Inside, a quiet calculation began. People forget that a whisper in the wrong ear can travel further than any shout. Henry paused, studying my reaction. "I thought you should know before she pulls anything you can't undo." I met his gaze evenly. "Information's only useful if you know exactly when to use it." He gave a short nod, as if approving the answer, but then his expression shifted. hesitation in the set of his jaw. One more thing. I didn't want to mention it unless I was sure, but there's a chance someone from your own side was there that night, sitting close enough to hear everything. The words landed with a slow, heavy weight. Who? I can't give you a name yet, he said. If I'm wrong, it's just gossip. But if I'm right, you'll want more than my word before you act. I took a measured breath, the coolness of the tea sharp on my tongue. So you're telling me to smile at every family dinner while wondering which of them already sold me out? I'm telling you, he said evenly, that if you tip your hand too soon, you'll lose the advantage. Let them think they're ahead. I leaned back, eyes tracing the brass trim of the lamp between us. I'll need to confirm what you've told me. Do that, he replied. And when you're ready, I'll help you line the pieces up. We finished the last of our drinks in companionable silence. The conversation had left no room for small talk. Everything now was about what came next. As I rose, Henry gave me a look that was almost conspiratorial. We'll speak again. Soon. Outside, the night wrapped around me with a mix of salt air from the harbor and the faint sweetness of magnolia blossoms. Street lamps stretched long shadows across the cobblestones, and my heels clicked in a steady rhythm. Truth is a blade, useless until you know exactly where to cut. By the time the wedding day came, I'd know exactly whose hand was holding the knife. The next morning, the low winter sun cast a pale gold over Charleston as I eased my car onto the Ben Sawyer Bridge. The tide was out, leaving the marsh grass exposed and glistening in the light, and the salty breeze slipping through the cracked window carried a memory that hit like a whisper from decades ago. Barefoot summers, iced tea sweating on the porch, Henry's laugh echoing from the dock. Those days felt as if they belonged to someone else's life now. The bridge's steel framework rattled faintly beneath the tires, and as the island came into view, a part of me braced for what I might find. The Harkins house sat at the far end of a quiet lane, its cedar shingles weathered to a soft gray, shutters sun-bleached and sagging in places. The live oaks flanking the drive were the same, their limbs twisted with age, but the air felt colder somehow, as if the land itself sensed the fractures in the family that once gathered here. I spotted Amos by the side porch, wiping his hands on a rag. 70-something now, he still had the wiry build of a man used to physical work, and the same unreadable expression that had kept our neighbors guessing his opinions for half a century. "Morning, Mr. Amos," I said, stepping out and pulling my coat tighter. "Miss Vianette?" he nodded, eyes scanning me briefly. "Didn't expect you back so soon." "Neither did I replied. "How's the place holding up?" "Well enough," he said, then hesitated. "Though, you might want to know, someone's been by, more than once." "Not me." The words landed like a drop of ice down my spine. "Recently?" "Couple weeks back, maybe sooner. I kept an eye out, but they were in and gone quick." I thanked him without pushing further. His guarded tone told me I'd get more from his silences later than from a direct question now. Inside, the air was tinged with dust and the faint, musty sweetness of wood left shut too long. I moved through the hallway, the creak of each board underfoot like a reminder of just how many years had passed since I'd lived here full-time. My destination was the study. The door stuck before opening. Not locked, just reluctant. Inside, the dim light caught motes of dust floating lazily in the air. The heavy mahogany desk dominated the space, its drawers slightly ajar, as if someone had rummaged through them and forgotten to tidy up. My pulse quickened. I ran my fingertips along the row of ledgers lining the shelves. Henry's old financial records, bound in cracked leather. They'd been undisturbed for years, until now. One stood out. A thin leather ribbon, newer than the rest, peeked from its pages. I slid it out, felt its unexpected weight, and tucked it deep into my tote bag. Not here. Not now. The attic stairs groaned under my steps, each one narrow and worn smooth by decades of use. A flashlight beam cut through the dimness as I reached the top. The air was warmer, close with insulation and time. Stacked against the far wall were bankers' boxes, each marked only with a year. My gaze snagged on one, the year Henry's estate had been finalized. Kneeling, I slit the tape with a nail file from my bag. Inside, beneath a layer of yellowed receipts, was a folder stamped with the letterhead of Margot's law firm. My breath caught as I scanned the first page. Correspondence between one of my own relatives and her attorneys. They weren't vague pleasantries. These letters detailed quiet cooperation to guide certain property divisions in Margot's favor when the time came. No direct betrayals spelled out, but enough coded language to leave no doubt. The words blurred for a moment as a hot, sharp sting rose in my chest. It wasn't just the legal maneuvering. It was knowing someone who shared my blood had chosen her side without so much as a warning. I slid the folder into my tote, its presence there heavy and cold. Descending the attic stairs, I found Amos at the bottom, leaning lightly on the railing. His eyes flicked to the tote before meeting mine. "Some snakes wear family skin," he said quietly. I paused, searching his face for more. "And some snakes keep their heads down until the grass is cut," I replied. His mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "Be careful who you corner first. Spook the wrong one, and the rest will vanish before you can grab the tail." "Do you know who's been here?" I asked. He just shrugged, a slow lift of one shoulder that told me he knew exactly what I was asking, and that he wasn't ready to answer. Not yet. I stepped past him into the cooler air of the hallway, the weight of the tote digging into my shoulder. In the kitchen, I paused long enough to glance through the window toward the dunes. The gulls circled above the shore, their cries sharp and restless. Outside, the sunlight was blinding after the attic's gloom. I closed the car door, sat for a moment, and let my hands rest on the tote in my lap. Family loyalty, I thought, isn't some sacred bond. It can be bartered away without a single word spoken aloud, traded for advantage, for comfort, for the promise of a better seat at the table. I started the engine, feeling the weight beside me shift slightly with the motion. Evidence. My first real piece in whatever game Margot thought she was playing. If they wanted a war over what was mine, they'd just given me my first weapon. The first thing I did the morning after leaving Sullivan's Island was find Samuel Briggs's number in my old address book. The ink had faded, the pages curled from years of being shoved in and out of drawers, but his name stood out clear enough. My husband had trusted Samuel with every penny, every tax return, every uncomfortable conversation about estate planning. If there was anyone who could help me understand what I had found in that dusty study, it was him. I dialed, half expecting his secretary to answer, but the man himself picked up on the second ring. His voice was the same as I remembered. Low, deliberate, with that Charleston drawl that made every sentence sound like a considered truth. "Samuel, it's Vianette Harkins." A pause. "Well, been too long. What can I do for you, Miss Vianette?" "I've come across a few old documents, ledgers, correspondence from Thomas's estate years ago. I think you might be the only one who can make sense of them." Another pause. Then, "This the kind of thing best discussed in person?" "Yes, somewhere quiet." By the time we hung up, we'd agreed on a small waterfront cafe just off East Bay Street. Dusk, when the last of the tourists had gone and the harbor turned from gold to black, I slid the ledger and the Sullivan's Island folder into a locked leather folio, tucking it into the bottom of my tote. The weight of it seemed heavier than paper should be, as if every secret inside pressed down on me. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone already suspected where I was headed. When I walked into the cafe that evening, the place smelled of brewed coffee and sea air drifting in through an open side door. Samuel sat in the corner, back to the wall, facing the entrance. Old habits die hard, I thought. His suit was neat, but not new, His tie knotted just so, like a man who still believed presentation mattered. "Evening, Miss Vianette," he said, standing to pull out my chair. I slid the folio onto the table between us. "I think Thomas left me a trail, Samuel. I just don't know how to follow it." He opened the ledger carefully, running a thumb down the first page before flipping through. His brow furrowed as he moved faster, stopping here and there to tap a finger against an entry. "These look ordinary at first," he murmured. "But see here, initials instead of full names. Transaction notes that don't say much. Transfer, allocation, services rendered. That's intentional. And this," he pointed to a series of amounts, all within a narrow range, recorded over a span of months. "This matches the sale of a set of properties in Mount Pleasant, but those sales didn't go through any public listing. They went private. Cash deals, handled through Margot's firm." The words settled between us like a slow leak of air. "You're saying this ledger proves that they moved assets without declaring them to the probate court?" "Likely." "Which would mean misappropriation, maybe even fraud, depending on how it was done." I sat back, letting that sink in. This wasn't just betrayal in the way I'd feared. It was potentially criminal. The lines between family grievance and legal violation had just blurred. Halfway through the ledger, Samuel slowed again. Between 2 pages, tucked flat and unnoticed at first, was a folded sheet of paper. He pulled it free and studied the handwriting. "This yours?" I knew it before he asked. Thomas's hand, slanted, deliberate, with that flourish at the end of his Y's. My throat tightened as I unfolded it. "If they come for what's yours," it read, "look for the lockbox in the study wall. Combination 190742. Below the numbers, just a dash and the words, "Contingency Plan." I stared at the paper, the noise of the cafe dimming around me. The study on Sullivan's Island had a wall safe, one I'd never opened. I'd assumed it was my father-in-law's, long since emptied. I'd never had the code, until now. Samuel leaned back. "Looks like Thomas thought ahead. I'd wager whatever's in that lockbox is tied to this ledger. Could be insurance. Could be instructions. Or ammunition," I said quietly. He nodded once. "If you're going to open it, do it discreetly. Don't breathe a word until you know exactly what you have. And for God's sake, don't keep the originals at home." We talked in lower tones after that. He urged me to put both the ledger and the letter in a safety deposit box to work only from copies. He offered to connect me with a lawyer he trusted outside Charleston, someone untainted by family loyalties or Margot's reach. When we stood to leave, I slipped the letter back into the ledger into the folio, and the folio back into my tote. Outside, the night air was cooler than I expected, the scent of salt and diesel drifting from the harbor. Lights from the anchored boats shimmered against the dark water. For the first time in weeks, I felt something close to purpose. I had evidence, I had a lead, and I had my husband's voice, reaching out from the past, telling me where to go next. But as I walked toward my car, I couldn't shake the sense of eyes on me. The sidewalk was empty, the cafe behind me quiet, but that prickle at the back of my neck wouldn't ease. If those numbers meant what I thought they did, tomorrow I'd be standing in front of a safe that hadn't been opened in 20 years. And something told me I wasn't the only one who wanted to know what was inside. The drive back to Sullivan's Island was quiet except for the low hum of the tires on the bridge. The morning light bounced off the water, scattering shards of silver across the marsh. I kept my hand steady on the wheel, but my eyes flicked to the rear view more often than necessary. Samuel's warning was still echoing in my head. Once Margot caught wind of what I'd found, she wouldn't just sit still. The house came into view, weathered but standing proud against the salt wind. Even from the driveway, I could smell the briny air, laced with the faint scent of mildew from months of disuse. Unlocking the front door, I stepped inside and felt the shift in the air. Heavier, as though the walls themselves had been holding their breath. I walked through the rooms with quick, deliberate steps. The wooden floors creaked underfoot, a sound that might have been comforting in another life but now seemed almost intrusive. My eyes scanned the furniture, the shadows. A dining chair was an inch off from where it should be, and the small door to the laundry room didn't close all the way. I paused, listening. Nothing. Just the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional gull calling from the shore. Satisfied I was alone, I made my way to the study. Samuel's voice ran through my mind. Enter, find the safe, retrieve, leave. No lingering, no second guessing. The oak desk was heavier than it looked, and moving it scraped a faint arc into the rug. Behind it, the paneling showed its age, edges rubbed smooth, faint scuff marks betraying years of quiet use. My fingers found the notch, and I eased the wood back, revealing the safe's metal face. The numbers from my husband's note were etched into my memory. I turned the dial carefully, each click like the beat of a distant drum. At first, the mechanism resisted, as if weighing whether to grant me entry. Then, with a reluctant sigh, it gave way. I hesitated, my hand on the handle. Whatever lay inside was more than just metal and paper. It was the last piece of him I hadn't yet touched. A message from the grave. Slowly, I pulled it open. The hinges groaned like they'd been asleep for decades. Inside, everything was arranged with a precision that spoke of him. Neat stacks of envelopes, a small velvet pouch, a manila folder, and a sealed letter addressed in his unmistakable hand. I reached for the pouch first. Inside, an antique brooch caught the light, its deep blue stone set in delicate gold filigree. Nestled beside it was a small silver key, the number 17 engraved into its surface. No explanation. No note. The manila folder was thicker than I expected. I opened it to find bank statements. Not from any account I recognized. My breath caught when I saw my own name printed at the top. The balances were substantial, spread across years, untouched. He'd been saving this for me. The envelopes contained receipts for property taxes, maintenance bills, all for assets I'd never heard mentioned. A cabin in North Carolina, a plot of land in Florida. Finally, I turned to the letter. My fingers lingered on the seal before breaking it. His handwriting flowed across the page, steady and sure. He wrote of regret for not telling me sooner, for hiding these things. He explained that he'd feared Margot's interference, that he suspected she'd try to dismantle what little security I had if given the chance. If you're reading this, he wrote, then they've begun to circle. The account is yours. The properties are yours. Protect them. And if they come for you, remember, you still have the key. By the time I finished, my vision blurred, not from grief alone, but from the sharp clarity of what he'd done. He'd prepared for this moment, knowing the betrayal would come. I folded the letter carefully, pressing my palm to it as though I could still feel the warmth of his hand. I packed everything into my leather folio, arranging it as neatly as he had left it. The safe door closed with a reluctant click, and I shifted the desk back into place. To any casual glance, the study looked untouched. Samuel's instructions were clear. Originals in a safety deposit box. Work from copies. I decided then. I'd head straight to the bank before doing anything else. The silver key weighed in my pocket, and I wondered if it matched a deposit box he'd opened years ago. That would have to wait. I left the study, locking the front door behind me. The sun was higher now, pouring through the salty air, but something in the stillness made me pause. A dark sedan was parked farther down the road, unfamiliar and too clean to belong to the neighbors. I didn't stop moving. Down the porch steps, across the gravel, I unlocked my car with a steady hand. Sliding behind the wheel, I started the engine, letting the hum settle me. I pulled out slowly, forcing myself not to glance back too often. In the rear view, the sedan stayed put, but the unease sat in my chest like a stone. Whoever they were, they knew where I'd been, And now they might have some idea of what I'd found. The safe had given me answers, but it had also painted a target squarely on my back. Charleston was alive that afternoon, the sidewalks pulsing with tourists carrying boutique shopping bags and sipping overpriced iced coffees. Street musicians played on corners, their tunes competing with the chatter of guided walking tours. All around me, the city felt bright, but my purpose was anything but casual. I turned onto Meeting Street, slowing just enough to scan for parking with a clear view of the bank entrance. The glass facade gleamed in the sun, reflecting back a neat row of palm trees swaying in the warm breeze. I spotted a parallel space across from the entrance and pulled in, the tires nudging the curb. Sitting there for a moment, I watched the revolving glass door turn, people stepping in and out as if they didn't have the weight of secrets in their hands. Samuel's voice played in my head like a refrain. Keep it short. Keep it discreet. Never volunteer information. I smoothed the front of my blouse, slipped the numbered key into my palm, and stepped out into the heat. The bank's air conditioning hit me like a wave as soon as I walked in, carrying with it the faint smell of polished wood and carpet cleaner. A young teller behind the counter straightened immediately. "Good afternoon, ma'am. How can we help you today?" His tone was polite but perfunctory, the kind reserved for people they assumed were here for something simple. "I need to access a safety deposit box," I said, my voice steady. I slid my driver's license and the small silver key across the counter. He examined the key, brows pulling slightly before he typed into his terminal. After a moment, he paused. Too long. "Yes, ma'am. There's a box under your name. It hasn't been accessed in 12 years. He glanced up at me, his curiosity flickering but quickly masked. "I'd like to see it now," I said, sharper than I intended. "One moment, please." He disappeared through a side door, and moments later, a man in a tailored suit appeared. The bank manager. His handshake was firm, but his eyes assessed me as though filing away details. "This way, Mrs. Harkins," he said, guiding me down a carpeted hallway lined with framed photographs of Charleston landmarks. Above each doorway, small black domes, security cameras, kept silent watch. The vault area smelled faintly metallic, like coins and cold steel. He led me into a private viewing room with a table and 2 chairs, then disappeared to retrieve the box. The wait felt longer than it could have been, but finally he returned, setting the long metal box on the table before stepping back. I turned the key, the click resonating in the small room. Lifting the lid, I found neatly arranged files, envelopes, and one small black case. The first stack was a set of bank statements, but not from any institution I recognized. My eyes skimmed the headers, offshore accounts, the kind that didn't just happen by accident. The balances were significant, but what stopped me cold were the names tied to them, shell companies under Margot's control. Beneath that was a folder of correspondence, my husband's handwriting alongside an attorney's neat script. Letters dated years ago outlined contingency measures if the family trust was compromised. I read quickly, my pulse steadying with each word that confirmed he had anticipated this war long before I saw it coming. At the bottom lay a series of photographs, glossy and well-lit. Margot, unmistakable in her sharp suits and practiced smile, meeting with a man I didn't recognize in what looked like a hotel lobby. The timestamps were from years before my husband's death. I stared at one photo, Margot leaning in close, the man's hand on her arm, and felt the air grow colder around me. Finally, I reached for the envelope at the very bottom, marked in his familiar hand, "Only open if you must." My hands shook slightly as I broke the seal. Inside was a notarized addendum to his will. The language was unambiguous. Specific assets, including the cabin in North Carolina and the Florida property, were to be transferred solely to me, bypassing Margot entirely. I sat back, the paper trembling just enough for me to notice. It was vindication, yes, but it was also a fresh wave of loss. He had known. He had fought for me in the only way he could, from a place where he couldn't see the end of the battle. I folded the documents neatly, placing them aside before closing the box temporarily. Poking my head out into the hallway, I caught the manager's attention. "Do you have a copier available for clients?" He hesitated. "It's not standard practice, but yes, right this way." The copier room was small, the hum of the machine filling the silence between us. I made high-quality copies of every page, every photograph, sliding them into my leather folio. The originals went back into the box exactly as I had found them. When I locked it again, the manager's gaze avoided mine, his politeness now edged with something else, maybe suspicion, maybe caution. Walking back toward the lobby, I noticed the camera mounted directly above the private room's door. Its small red light glowed steady. Someone, somewhere, now had a record of my visit. Outside, the afternoon sun was still warm, but the light seemed sharper, the shadows longer. I clutched the folio to my side as I crossed the street to my car. Halfway there, I saw him. A man in a baseball cap, leaning against a lamppost across the way, cigarette smoke curling in the breeze. He was looking in my direction, but his face was unreadable from here. I didn't break stride. Unlocking my car, I slid inside, the leather seats hot from the sun. Starting the engine, I glanced up. The man was gone. The folio sat on the passenger seat, its weight undeniable. I had the truth in my hands, but I was starting to realize the truth had a way of drawing shadows. I heard the sound before I saw them, the slow crunch of tires grinding over the gravel driveway. It was a noise that belonged to this property, one that I'd heard thousands of times over the years, but tonight it carried a different weight. I moved to the front window, parting the curtain just enough to catch sight of Margot stepping out of a sleek black sedan, her hair pulled back so tightly it might have been sculpted. The late sunlight caught the gold threads in her expensive pantsuit. But it was the man beside her, mid-40s, thin-rimmed glasses, carrying a slim leather briefcase, that told me everything I needed to know. A lawyer. So this is how she wanted to play it. I opened the door before she reached it, standing in the frame like I owned every inch of it, because I did. No smile, no warmth, just the silent invitation to enter. The air between us felt like glass, ready to shatter. "Vianette," she said crisply, stepping inside without waiting for me to say yes. "This is Mr. Cole, my attorney." "Good evening," the man murmured, his voice a careful blend of politeness and purpose. Margot wasted no time. "I'm here to exercise my legal right to assume management of the estate. Given the recent financial instability in the family, it's in everyone's best interest." Her words landed like tiny darts. Mr. Cole opened his briefcase, producing a stack of papers with the ease of someone who had done this before. The documents were pristine, clearly prepared in advance. I led them into the sitting room, letting them take the sofa while I remained standing. I didn't bother offering drinks. I listened without interruption. Years with Samuel had taught me that silence was often the sharpest weapon. While Margot spoke, I studied her lawyer, how his eyes flickered toward her when she made a bold claim, the way his thumb rubbed the edge of the papers as though he wasn't entirely sure of them himself. Samuel's advice echoed in my head. Let them talk themselves into a corner before you move. She grew more confident as she spoke, her voice steady but her foot tapping lightly on the rug. I caught subtle flaws, dates that didn't align with known events, missing notary seals on certain authorizations, sloppy work, or maybe she thought I wouldn't notice. I kept my face unreadable, though inside I felt the familiar mix of irritation and something close to pity. Margot had always been talented, charming when she wanted, resourceful when backed into a corner, but greed made her short-sighted. When she finally set her chin and folded her hands, waiting for my reply, I let the quiet stretch just long enough to make her shift uncomfortably. Without a word, I crossed to my desk and retrieved my leather folio. The clasp clicked open like a starter's pistol in a race. "These," I said, sliding a set of documents onto the coffee table, "are the executed papers for the will's addendum I found." Her brow furrowed. "Addendum?" Yes, I continued, my tone smooth as cream. The one your father signed, notarized, and left in a place you'd never think to look. It has already been executed. The assets have been transferred into a trust under my sole control. I let that sink in, watching the lawyer's eyes scan the documents. His expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough for me to see the confidence falter. You see, Margot, I said, leaning slightly toward her, you can't take what's no longer here, dear. Color rose to her cheeks, a blotchy red that spread fast. She reached for the papers, but I held them in place with one finger. Several of the properties you were hoping to manage aren't part of the estate anymore, nor are the accounts. I tilted my head. Your claim isn't just weak, it's non-existent. For a moment, the room was so quiet I could hear the faint tick of the mantel clock. Inside, I felt the steady pulse of satisfaction, not just for winning, but for ensuring she'd think twice before trying again. The mask cracked. Margot's voice sharpened, her hands gripping her knees. You've manipulated this entire situation, betrayed me. I met her gaze, steady and unblinking. Betrayal? I gave you years of kindness, of opportunity. You squandered every one. This, I gestured to the folio, is the consequence. Her lawyer cleared his throat, murmuring her name in an attempt to calm her, but she shook him off. You think this is over? She snapped. If you pursue this further, I replied evenly, I'll have no choice but to make certain documents from the deposit box very public. I think you'd prefer to avoid that. The implication hung in the air. She knew I wasn't bluffing. She stood abruptly, the legs of the chair scraping against the hardwood. This isn't over, she hissed, storming toward the door. I didn't follow. I stood at the window, watching as she yanked open the car door, slamming it hard enough to rattle the frame. Gravel sprayed behind the wheels as the sedan shot down the drive, disappearing into the shadows beyond the gate. Turning back toward the study, I placed the folio on my desk. That's when I saw it. A small, folded note resting beside the lamp. It hadn't been there earlier. I picked it up, feeling the weight of it in my hand. The handwriting was unfamiliar, the strokes deliberate. It wasn't Margot's handwriting, and that was the part that made my hands go cold. The note sat where I'd left it on the desk, small enough to vanish in a single closed fist, but heavy in a way paper shouldn't be. I picked it up carefully, almost expecting it to be warm. The paper was thick, the kind that costs more than it should, and carried a faint lavender scent. That alone told me Margot hadn't written it. Her perfume was sharp, citrusy, the kind that lingered in a room like a dare. The handwriting was deliberate, each letter standing tall and even, not the rushed scrawl of someone jotting a grocery list. I turned it over in my hands, wondering whether to open it right then or lock it away in my file cabinet until I'd had more time to think. That would have been the sensible thing to do, control the timing, keep the advantage, but curiosity is a stubborn animal. It leans in, pries at you until you give it what it wants. So I slid a finger under the flap, breaking the faint glue line, and unfolded it slowly, as if speed might make the words bite. There was no greeting, no signature, just a short message written in that careful hand. She's not finished. Watch the gardener's shed tomorrow at dusk. No more than 12 words, and yet they landed with the weight of a gavel. My first thought was Margot, of course. She was the obvious she. But the lack of a name left room for doubt, and doubt is dangerous. There were other women in our orbit. Some I trusted, some I didn't. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the words until they blurred. The gardener's shed. The phrase pulled up an old memory. Samuel kneeling on the shed's floor, prying up the loose board where he kept an old lockbox and a set of backup files. I hadn't thought about that hiding place in years. If it was still there, then whoever wrote this note knew far more about this property and about me than most people. It could be a bluff, it could be a trap, or it could be the kind of warning you don't ignore without paying for it later. I stood, walking to the window that overlooked the back lawn. The shed was a dark smudge at the far end of the property, framed by the skeletal branches of the pecan trees. From here, it looked harmless, almost quaint, but I knew better than to trust appearances. I brought the note back under the lamp and studied the strokes, the rounded A, the looping H. It wasn't entirely unfamiliar. Then it hit me. Years ago, Samuel's assistant, Marlene, used to send us Christmas cards with that same exact A. Marlene, who vanished from our lives after Samuel's death without explanation. Why now? Why this? If it was her, it meant she'd been close enough to watch the family's cracks widen and close enough to hear Margot's name whispered in the wrong kinds of conversations. Allies don't step out of the shadows unless the storm is worse than you think. I felt the beginnings of a shiver along my spine, not from fear, but from the cold clarity that came with realizing Margot's reach was longer than I'd allowed myself to imagine. This wasn't just about the will or even the estate. There was a game happening behind the one I could see, and the gardener's shed was somehow in play. I decided against telling anyone in the house. The fewer people who knew, the fewer mouths that could leak it back to Margot. I'd been underestimated before, but not because I left my cards face up. Moving upstairs, I stopped at the landing window and peered out again. Nothing stirred near the shed. Just the slow creep of evening, shadows sliding longer across the grass. Still, I could picture a dozen ways this could go wrong. Margot planting something incriminating or removing something that belonged to me. Or maybe she'd send someone to make the whole shed vanish in a late-night accident. I started making a mental list for tomorrow. Flashlight, phone recorder, Samuel's duplicate key that I kept hidden in a sewing basket, and gloves, thin enough to keep my grip, thick enough to keep my fingerprints to myself. I'd also need the small camera I'd once used to catch raccoons in the attic. I could set it near the shed tonight, just in case something happened before dusk tomorrow. By the time I returned to the study, the sky outside had deepened to a bruised violet. I tucked the note into my robe pocket, the paper warm now from my hand. The clock ticked steadily, as if reminding me that every minute between now and tomorrow's sunset was a chance for Margot, or whoever she was, to make their move first. I reached to turn off the lamp, but something caught my eye. The faint outline of a second slip of paper inside the same envelope. It was thinner, almost translucent against the light. My breath slowed as I slid it free. The handwriting was smaller, tighter, as though the writer hadn't wanted it seen unless it had to be. Only one line. If you're reading this, they already know I told you. I froze, the weight of those words sinking in fast. My gaze lifted to the window instinctively, scanning the dark grounds beyond. Somewhere in the stillness, I thought I caught the faintest movement near the hedgerow, a shadow shifting where no wind was blowing. A slow, measured heartbeat thudded in my ears. Somewhere out there, someone was already moving, and I wasn't sure if they were coming for the shed or for me. The rain had started early, a fine mist that clung to my coat and worked its way into my hair. By the time I reached the back of the property, the slick ground and the dark canopy of pecan branches made every step deliberate. I'd chosen my spot well, half hidden by an overgrown hydrangea bush, close enough to the gardener's shed to hear a latch turn, but far enough to stay invisible in the shadows. I checked my watch. 5 minutes until the time in the note. The air was taut, the kind of quiet where even the distant hum of the pool filter sounded louder than it should. Every drop of rain hitting the shed's tin roof registered like a drumbeat. My phone was already in my hand, the camera app open, thumb hovering over the record button. Then I saw movement. A figure came from the path leading up from the side gate, hood pulled low, body angled forward against the rain. I didn't need to see her face to know the way her shoulders rolled with each step. Margot. I'd watched her march into boardrooms with that same predatory stride. I hit record. The red dot blinked, and the audio meter danced with the sound of her footsteps crunching over wet leaves. She didn't hesitate when she reached the shed, pulled a small key from her pocket and slipped inside as though she owned the place. From my angle, I caught her in profile under the dim light she switched on. She went straight to a stack of boxes along the far wall. Even from here, I could make out the bold black labels: Samuel's estate records and confidential legal. She tore the top off one, flipped through a sheaf of papers, and began taking pictures with her phone. Then she started shoving others into a black duffel bag that sagged under the weight. I shifted, keeping my camera steady, zooming in to capture every move. Her hair clung to her cheek where the rain had seeped past her hood. She was methodical, quick but not careless. A low rumble of thunder rolled overhead. Margot froze mid-motion, her head snapping toward the door. I held my breath, every muscle locked. She scanned the dark outside for a moment that felt much longer than it was, then, apparently satisfied, turned back to her task. That was my cue. I stepped out from behind the hydrangeas, closing the distance in silence until I stood in the doorway. My flashlight cut a sharp beam across her face, catching the glint of water on her skin. "Going somewhere with my late husband's legal records, Margot?" My voice was steady, almost conversational. She straightened, but didn't drop the papers in her hand. "I'm protecting the estate from your mismanagement," she shot back, like it was a prepared line. I took one slow step inside. "Is that what we're calling theft now?" I lifted my phone, the live video feed still running. "This is streaming directly to my attorney's office, and to the police. I'm sure they'll appreciate the timestamp." Her eyes flicked to the phone, then back to me. "You don't understand what you're doing." "Oh, I do," I said. "I also understand that the staff gave notarized affidavits about your threats. They've been filed. Along with this footage, you're going to have a very difficult time explaining how you ended up with confidential legal documents in your possession." She laughed, but it was thin and unsteady. "You think you can just push me out?" I let her words hang in the damp air for a beat. "The restraining order was filed this morning. It covers the house, the grounds, and every scrap of estate material. You step foot here again, and you'll be escorted out in handcuffs." Her lips parted, but I wasn't finished. "And that codicil Samuel signed? The one that allows removal of any beneficiary acting with malicious intent? It's been executed. You keep this up, and you won't see a dime." I watched the fight drain from her posture, replaced by a sharp, calculating stillness. She glanced at the duffel bag, then at the door. "Your only way out," I said, "is to leave tonight. Quietly. Or tomorrow morning I will make this public and you'll be the one answering questions on courthouse steps." For a moment she didn't move. Then, slowly, she set the papers back in the box, lifted the duffel, and dropped it to the floor with a dull thud. Without another word, she brushed past me into the rain. I didn't watch her go. I stepped forward, closed the box, and locked the shed. The keys jingled in my steady hand, a sound as final as a judge's gavel. The walk back to the house felt longer than it was, rain streaking my coat while the windows glowed ahead of me. Inside, the study's lamplight spilled across the desk like a welcome. I set the recovered documents in the safe, turned the lock, and rested my hand on the cool metal. Strength isn't loud. Sometimes it's the quiet, steady hand that finally tips the scales.